Today is March 29th, 2004, and we're interviewing George Geib this afternoon in the library conference room at the Veterans Administration, Prescott, Arizona. I am Nancy Cannon, and with us in the room,
Patsy Ray, coordinator for the Veterans History Project.
And welcome to you, George.
Thank you.
And we're going to begin with your birth date, which is?
April 14, 1924,
And the city you are living in now.
Prescott, Arizona.
Thank you very much. And now we'll start out the so-called formal part of the interview with jogging your memory. So if you'll start at the beginning of your service time, or you said you were a cadet before you actually enlisted.
I think I'll go back even further than that,
Great.
Nancy. I first registered for the draft in 1940, and for some reason again in 1942. I don't know how that occurred, but I did. I must have felt the draft coming closer in late 1942 because the recruiters for the Air Force Air Cadet program came around to school, and I took their tests, decided I'd rather do that than be drafted into something I didn't want to do. So I took tests in December of 1942, and I was to be on a deferred status to graduate from Santa Barbara State College that I was attending at that time. That would have been in June 1944. The day I took my tests, I have a little story to tell you, but I'm going to have to go back even further. I have a book here with me that I put together. It's letters that I wrote during World War II. I was a prolific letter writer. I decided early on that in order to receive mail, you need to write letters. So I wrote to everybody I knew when I think when I first left home, and gradually that kind of pared down to family and very good friends. But I did write to my own family 2 or 3 times a week ordinarily. My mother saved all those letters, and when I came out of the service, she had this sack full of stuff, and she said, "Here are your letters." Well, I carried them around for I don't know how many years as I moved here and there. Finally, after I was married, one day my wife Lucy said, "I think you ought to do something with those letters. They're going to die of old age." So I got to thinking about it. Meanwhile, we had a computer that she had wanted. She had gone to Yavapai College here in Prescott to learn how to work it, and she taught me enough to get in and out of the computer without screaming help, help, help all the time. Anyway, I put all the letters together, and this is what I turned out. It's the letters from 1943 through the later part of 1946 that I wrote home. I never had this published. I did it myself, and just 30 copies for my family and for a few close friends.
You know, not only did you write the letters, but you prefaced or you expanded on
I did.
that.
In the book, in italicized print, I have added my own comments as I remember things, and I will be reading from this book quite a bit in this interview. I think this tells the story much better than perhaps I could recall it. My memory isn't what it used to be.
Oh, I think you'd be surprised.
Well,
But
we'll see. We'll see. So going back now to where
Okay.
I started a few minutes ago, when I went to take my test to get into the Air Force, I'll find the right page here. Here it is. I passed everything with flying colors except for one thing, and that was my weight. The Air Force had a minimum weight of 135 pounds, and I only weighed 130 pounds. So they gave me another chance that I could come the next day. I wrote about that here, and I want to read that to you. Eat bananas? Eat bananas, that's what he said. I was speaking with my mother. I had just returned from an all-day session of both written and physical examinations, which would, if I passed both, allow me to become a part of the deferred student program in the Army Air Force. I felt that I'd done well on the written portion and had successfully passed all the physicals except for the weight requirement. The Air Force had a minimum weight of 135 pounds for admittance into the program, and I'd weighed in at only 130 pounds. I was told that I could come back in the morning and try again if I thought it would do any good. By the tone of the offer, I knew that there was no expectation that I could gain the necessary weight overnight. When I announced this at home, my mother was on the telephone to our family doctor at once, and he told her, have him eat bananas, have a good fattening dinner, get lots of rest, go to bed early, and above all else, tell him not to go to the bathroom. For the balance of the day, I was treated like a king. My mother, my father, and my sister all waited on me hand and foot while I rested on the living room couch and gave orders to bring on the bananas. The following morning, I woke to a huge bowl of oatmeal, which I detest, and was told by the family to move slowly, and when it was time to leave at 9 a.m. for the weighing in, my mother insisted that she dry me so I could conserve my energy. On my way into the room where the physicals were being given, I stopped at the drinking fountain and tanked up with water. Since I was a recall, it did not take long for my name to be called. I had also stripped to my shorts, so I waddled over the scale, climbed on, and was elated when the sergeant announced my weight at 137 pounds. I nearly didn't make it to the bathroom at the end of the hall. If I'd been required to step on the scale again after that trip, I know I would have failed the physical. When I arrived home, I weighed 132 pounds.
So that took care of that.
That took care of that.
Now, where were you living at the time of all this?
I was in Santa Barbara, California.
And why did you decide to join up?
Well, as I mentioned, of course, I had to sign up for the draft when I did. And then in thinking about it, the Air Force sounded glamorous. I think it does to all young men. And I'd always kind of liked the idea of flying, as a matter of fact. And I thought, I'm going to try to be a pilot. I knew even at that time that a lot of people who enlisted did not make it to the pilot status, but they did stay in the Air Force. So I thought I'd give it a try.
And you were going to school at the time? You were
I
in college.
had a year and a half of college at that point, yes.
Had you decided on any kind of a life career for yourself at that point?
I was taking a major so that I could be a teacher when I graduated. Actually, Santa Barbara was a state teachers college. It changed while I was away to become the University of California. So I changed after my major, but at that time I was going to be a teacher.
So after you were enlisted, just the first few days, what were the first few days of that?
Well,
like?
I want to go back again a little
Okay.
bit. After what I've just talked about, I had a letter, an information letter telling me, this is in February 1943, an information letter from the government telling me I would be called to active duty within a few days. Then the next letter I got was to report to Lincoln Air Force Base in Nebraska by March 5th, 1943 for pre-cadet training. That's what happened to my deferred status. It was deferred for less than 2 months, I think.
It wasn't very deferred, but you
Not
got in
very
the Air
deferred.
Force.
It was
yeah.
okay. I left Santa Barbara by train for Los Angeles on the 1st of March. There were about let's back up here. I want to read this again from the book. On March 1st, 1943, just 44 days short of my 19th birthday, I was standing on the platform at the Santa Fe Depot in Santa Barbara, California, waiting for the daylight to arrive on its daily run from San Francisco to Los Angeles. Through the years, I'd met the daylight many times, either to see someone off or to pick up somebody who was coming for a visit. This time it was coming for me. My father had gone to work, my sister had gone to school, and that left my mother to see me off. She'd been so teary since I'd received my orders that we all thought it'd be a good idea if somebody else went along with us. A close family friend agreed to do this, and she drove us to the railroad station where I would board the train for the first leg of the journey, which in a few days would deliver me to Lincoln Air Base and the start of my Army career. Mother and I nearly had a falling out on this final day. She had insisted that I take my overcoat on this trip, and I had flatly refused. There was absolutely no way that this almost soldier from California was going to be seen wearing an overcoat over his cords and t-shirt. I agreed to take a jacket or a sweater, but no overcoat. When we arrived at the depot, we saw many of my friends and classmates who were making the same train, but no overcoats were to be seen, either being worn or being carried. As the train pulled out of the station, we said our final goodbyes. Mother's tears came faster and heavier than ever, and then I was on the train, overcoat and all. As we pulled out, I noticed the whole platform was full of ladies with white hankies dabbing at their wet eyes. We arrived at Fort MacArthur late that afternoon, and I wrote a postcard home telling everybody that I had survived the train trip to Los Angeles without mishap. It's only 100 miles from station to station. As soon as we left the Los Angeles train station, I began to write letters home on a regular basis and continued to write over the next 3+ years.
Now, is that first postcard, did your mother keep that too?
Oh, yes.
She kept that
yes.
right there too?
It was there too. She started the very first day.
Yeah.
Okay, then we had the trip to Lincoln Air Base. My parents had both been, well, no, my mother had been born in Nebraska. My dad had been born in Pennsylvania, but they met in Nebraska. They had lived in Omaha and Lincoln, and the fact I was going to Lincoln made the blow a little softer that I was leaving home. As it turned out, in the middle of winter, March it was cold, cold, cold in Lincoln, and I was in boot camp, so I didn't really see anything of the city anyway.
Do you remember your first day?
My first day there?
Yeah.
Oh, yes, I do. Getting off the train and sloshing through mud, ice, snow. We had to walk from the train tracks, which are fairly close to the base, but it seemed like we were being billeted on the other side of the base, and we walked for miles, and I wore my overcoat too. Yeah, let's see, just a minute here.
Are there any?
Oh.
Go ahead.
They weren't ready for us in Lincoln. They didn't have clothes for us. They didn't have the manpower to manage this. They didn't have the right food. They didn't have anything. So I made a note in here that some months later, we learned that Lincoln had been a last-minute substitute as an assembly point for pre-cadets. There had been an outbreak of illness at the originally scheduled base. Preparations had not been completed at Lincoln when the troops began to arrive. Cold weather clothing for issue was not there. Non-coms and officers had not been transferred to the base staff. The kitchens were not ready to handle the large number of soldiers arriving daily, and the weather was not cooperating at all. I never mentioned in a letter, but I knew how lucky I was to have given in to my mother on that overcoat issue. There's no doubt in my mind I stayed much, much warmer than most of the fellows during that long first week before clothes were issued. I remember I practically lived in that overcoat.
Did you have to do any training out there before they were properly clothed, before you were properly
Yes,
clothed?
the fellows wore what they had from home actually, and I think they had a few heavy sweaters or something they gave those who had nothing else to wear. But we marched in our civilian clothes until about a week later. Then I wrote a letter home, and I got this.
Sally, you have a call on 6013.
I wrote in the letter that what the inventory was of clothes we were issued, and it was like 2 pair OD trousers, 2 OD shirts, a tie, 2 pair long underwear and shirts, 5 pair of shorts and shirts, 1 windbreaker, a blouse, an overcoat. We got an overcoat. 5 hankies, 2 pair of suntan trousers, 2 suntan shirts, 2 overseas caps, 3 pair of wool socks, a pair of cotton socks, 2 pair of shoes, a pair of knit gloves, a pair of leather gloves, fatigue hat, knit cap, mess kit, canteen, leggings, and duffel bags. So, and when we got those things issued, it was really funny. They had everybody stripped down to their underwear, and we walked down this hallway. There were tables on both sides and stacks of these various items of clothing. And as you walked, whoever was behind the table looked you up and down and threw something at you. You didn't have an opportunity to try anything on
Not at all.
or anything.
No.
So when you got back to barracks and you tried them on, some fit, some didn't, and some fellows were able to trade with somebody else to get a better size. But
Okay, you mentioned OD shirt.
olive drab.
Olive drab. Okay.
We had
thank
olive
you.
drab in the winter and suntan in the summer. Right.
Mhm,
Good.
mhm. Very good. Very good.
I thought I might run through quickly the places I was stationed, then I'm going to talk about a few of them in a little more detail, if that sounds okay.
That sounds okay, but in your first couple of days, do you
Yes.
remember any instructors that have stuck in your memory?
Instructors?
Mhm.
Not a one.
Not a one.
No. We didn't see the same one twice, I don't think, for one thing. And this was all drill, some indoctrination into the Army, some films to watch. So there was no really instruction given by one particular instructor. Okay, you know I went to Lincoln Air Base. Then I went to pre-cadet schooling at Drury College in Springfield, Missouri. I may just talk about some of these as we go. Got there in March. We were only at Lincoln 6 weeks. We're shipped to Springfield, Missouri. I was a California native, raised there. Had never seen snow except one trip to Big Bear, I think, or something. We got to Missouri, and I saw hail as big as baseballs, between golf balls and baseballs. And I think we were all from California on this trip. We all just stood at the window and looked with our mouths open to see these big things falling down and bouncing on the ground. When we got to Drury, it was an old college, and it was beautiful, ivy-covered stone buildings. The rooms were very, very old. We did get some instruction there and things I'd had already in high school or college, math, basic math, chemistry, history, various things, but we did have some schooling there.
Did you have any physical training?
Oh yes, every place I went we had physical training, yes. Right. Most of the fellows at Drury College had gone off to the war, so we were there with mostly girls, and nobody minded that at all.
Not at all.
From there, I was transferred for basic training, back to Santa Ana, California. It was basic. Once we'd gotten out of the Western Command, I'd lost all hope of ever getting back to the West Coast, but somehow our group was transferred back to Santa Ana, and I spent from August to October there in 1943, and was able to get home, of course, on several occasions because that wasn't very far from Santa Barbara. Not too much eventful happened there.
During this time, George, was everybody really interested in what was happening with the war in Europe? Were you glued to the radios and things like that?
No, I think we were all more concerned with what was going on with us. I mean, we knew there was a big war over there. We didn't really talk about the situation. It was what's going to happen with us tomorrow. And somewhere in here I mentioned rumors were the lifeblood in the service.
Yes.
You would hear one today and you'd believe it. Maybe 2 days later, something entirely different, 180 degrees, a new rumor. So we fed on rumors, and most of them never panned out till the very last minute. From Santa Ana, the first sight of an airplane was at Ryan Field in Tucson, Arizona. That was my first experience of being in Arizona. And this little field outside of Tucson was a civilian field with civilian instructors, and we flew a little PT-19, PT being primary trainer, single engine, open cockpit, and the instructor sat in the front, you sat in the back. And that was as I say, my first experience.
How did that work? If he sat in the front and you sat in the back, did you have dual controls or something?
Yeah, we have dual controls, and also the plane slants. So being in the back, you're below, and you can't see much. So when you're taxiing, you had to go like this so that you could see around the airplane what was in front.
That was a good way of teaching?
I think so.
Do you?
It was the only way.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it worked out well.
Yeah.
While I was there, I unfortunately got the mumps. So I spent 3 weeks at David Monson Hospital in Tucson. When I got the mumps on graduation day from primary training, and so they didn't know what to do with me when I came out of the hospital. I'd already done everything. So they gave me a leave to go home for a couple of weeks, and then I came back and twiddled my thumbs until the next graduating class. The classes were numbered. I started out in class 44E, which would have been class of 1944, May. I ended up in class 44F, which put me into June. So, and I stayed with that class.
All through
my training.
Training.
In February of 1944, I came back to the West Coast to Cal Aero Flight Academy, which was in Ontario, California. And there we flew the BT-13, which is Basic Trainer 13. I had an aunt who lived in, an aunt and uncle actually, who lived in Riverside, California, not very far from Ontario, and I visited them on quite a few weekends, and my aunt came to see me a couple of times. I'll never forget on graduation day, here were these hundreds of troops lined up in formation, going through a formal parade, and I saw this crazy woman dashing all over the field with her camera. It turned out to be Aunt Grace, and I think she broke every military regulation there was on that day.
Did she get some pretty good pictures?
She got some fun pictures.
I'll bet she did.
And she wasn't arrested, so I guess it all came out all right. But that was funny. April to October in '44, I came back to Arizona to Williams Air Force Base in Chandler. And I learned about Phoenix in those days. Scottsdale, there was nothing there. They had rodeos right in the middle of what today is downtown Scottsdale. One of my classmates and I bought a motorcycle, and instead of taking the slow bus into Phoenix from those days, it was a long way to Chandler, we would ride the motorcycle in on weekends and stay at the Adams Hotel or one of the big ones down Santa Rita was, I guess that was in Phoenix. Anyway, the time went by and I graduated from Williams Air Force Base, and again, they didn't know what to do with me. Right then they didn't need pilots. So I sat in a pilot pool for some little time. Then they took some of us into flight instructor training. And we instructed we had our training in the AT-6, Advanced Trainer 6. And it was kind of a tricky little airplane in that the wheels were so close together that if you didn't watch what you were doing when you landed, you could skid around and ground loop the airplane. And I didn't care very much about thinking about being an instructor in that because, again, it was a hard airplane to fly for me, and I didn't want some kid not knowing what he was doing landing me.
Did you have any problems with any of these other training airplanes? Were they?
No, they were easy to fly compared to the AT-6. The Navy had the same one called SNJ. I don't know what that stood for, but anyway, AT-6 wasn't my favorite airplane. After I finished that, again, they didn't need pilots for a while, so I spent a lot of time in Phoenix sitting around. One weekend, I think we were in one of the hotel having a beer or something, and somebody came in and said, "Hey, you better get back to base. I see your name's on a list to be shipped out." So I got together and went back and found that, yes, indeed, I was on a list for a secret mission. Nobody knew exactly where it was to be or what it was. They'd asked for volunteers, and my dear roommate had signed up and also put my name down.
Well, how'd you feel about that?
I didn't think very highly of that. Well, at that time, it wasn't so bad. It was getting out. When I found out what I'd volunteered for, it was not so great. We were shipped to Laurinburg-Maxton Air Force Base in Maxton, North Carolina, and the next thing I knew, I was flying a glider. And I had 3 hours and 10 minutes, I think, in a glider learning how to fly. The instructor, I don't think, ever took his hands off the controls the whole time. I don't blame him either. And anyway, that took care of that. And we were kept there only a few days, and next thing I knew, I was on the way to Europe.
Was there a history of using gliders in the Air Force?
Indeed there was, and I'll tell you more about that a little later.
Okay.
But yes, there certainly was. They were not safe planes to fly, aircraft. Sorry about all these stickies, but it's the way I can figure out where I am. Glider training, yeah. I was at Pope Field, was learning to fly the GC-4 glider. My record of my flight log shows 3 hours and 40 minutes of flight time with 10 landings, and I was qualified as a glider pilot. That meant when I went overseas, I was a dual-rated pilot. I had both power trained, I was power trained and glider trained.
Where did they use the gliders?
They were towed behind C-47 troop carrier planes. They carried both troops and supplies into behind the lines.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to tell you about some of that a little later too.
But the purpose of using the gliders was to...
Get more people in, and then the glider would land there, and it was disposable. In fact, a lot of them were torn apart on landing. So once you landed, they very seldom picked up the gliders. Once in a while, if it was a clear field, they could. But the Germans had a nasty way of sticking spikes into the ground,
Yeah. pointing
pointing out where anybody would have to land into the wind. And if a glider hit this, just ripped it apart and all the people in it.
And then as a glider pilot, what happened to the pilot?
Well, a lot of them didn't come back.
They didn't come back.
In fact, we had glider pilots attached to our squadron, and the poor guys, I felt so sorry for them. When they would come in for coffee in the morning, they'd be shaking. And usually somebody had a flask. They put something in their coffee before they could get it down. They lived in terror. And I was halfway one of those because I didn't know whether there were any glider pilots or power pilots when I got to where I was going. I went over on the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary had been refitted as a troop ship, and it was kind of interesting. I have some more to read to you. The following letter was written while I was crossing the Atlantic Ocean aboard the Queen Mary, which had been converted to a troop ship during the war. Because of the ship's speed, we were able to cross alone without escorts or being part of a convoy. It was fascinating to stand on the stern of the ship and watch the wake as we changed course every 30 seconds. It created a nice herringbone pattern in the water, which you could see all the way to the horizon. I think we left New York Harbor on November 6th. I do know that we arrived at the Firth of Clyde in Scotland on what was in those days called Armistice Day, November 11th, 1944. About the Queen Mary, although it was now a troop ship, it still had much of the elegance of the early cruise ships. The main salon was like a large hotel lobby with red velvet drapes and overstuffed furniture, good for passing leisure time reading. There were also desks which could be used for writing letters. There was a stage at one end of the lounge, and the curtains were of red velvet. Sleeping accommodations were according to rank. The officers, pilots at least, were in staterooms which had been converted to hold 17 bunks, literally from floor to ceiling, all around the room. I think we had a basin and a toilet, as well as a shower in the room. This may sound crowded, and it was, but the enlisted men took turns, one night sleeping in the hold of a ship in large compartments, the next night in sleeping bags on the outdoor decks. They used the ship's public restroom facilities with no showers provided during our crossings. The officers were served meals that are in the regular ship's dining room, complete with linen tablecloths, silver flatware, printed and dated menus on some occasions during the crossing. The GIs lined up with their mess kits to go through a chow line, then sat in the stairwells or on decks to eat their meals. Part of our crossing was in fairly rough weather with large swells, and the bowels of the ship were hot and smelly. Some of the men had become seasick, and I was very glad I didn't have to spend my time below. This is the first time I'd seen RHIP in action, which means rank has its privileges. And uncomfortable, although I was very grateful for the difference in treatment at that time, I was also extremely uncomfortable and conscious of the unfairness of the system. Several years ago, my wife and I toured the Queen Mary after its conversion to a hotel in Long Beach, California. A mock-up of a stateroom for officers, just as it had been during World War II, brought back many memories of my voyage overseas.
What rank were you when you went over on the Queen Mary?
Second lieutenant.
You were.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and let's go back here. When we got to the Firth of Clyde in Scotland, we were only there a day or two, and then we were put on trains and brought down into England proper, and we stopped at a place, I think it was called Stone, England, to kind of regroup where the assigned people where they were supposed to go. From there, in later November 1944, I arrived at Saltby in England, which was